Chapter 4. Why do they yield? The psychodynamics of forced confession. Is there a bridge from the concept of the Pavlovian conditioning to deeper psychological understanding? Only in those Pavlovian theoreticians who deny the modern depths of psychology does there exist a conflict between concepts. Pavlov himself acknowledged the presence of deeper, hidden motivations in man and limitation to his study of animal behavior. Our task is to go back to the pre-Noshi, asking ourselves, how can we better convey an understanding of what happened to him? What were the Pavlovian circumstances, and what were the inner motivations to yield to enforced political manipulations of the mind? Was it cowardice? Was it a prison psychosis? Was it in the general loss of mental stamina in our world? In the following observation and experiences, I hope to make use of these clinical insights actually proposed by the modern depth psychology. The upset philosopher. One day in 1672, the only philosopher of reason, Spinoza, had to be forcibly restrained by his friends and neighbors. He wanted to rush out into the street and shout his indignation at the mob which had murdered his good friend Jean de Witt, noble statesman of the Dutch Republic, who had been falsely accused of treason. But presently he calmed down and retreated to his room, where, as usual, he grounded optical reasons according to daily and hitherto unbroken routine. As he worked, he thought back to his own behavior, which had been no more rational or sensible than the behavior of the rioting crowd which had killed de Witt. It was then that Spinoza realized the existence of the emotional beast hidden beneath the human reasons, which when aroused can act in the wanton destructive fashion and can conjure up thousands of justifications and excuses for its behavior. For, as Spinoza sensed, as the greater psychologist Sigmund Freud later demonstrated, people are not the rational creatures they think they are. In the unconscious, that vast storehouse of deeply buried memories, emotions and striving lie many infertile and irrational yearnings which constantly influence the conscious acts. All of us are governed to some degree by this hidden tyrant and the conflict between our reasons and our emotions, to the extent that we, the victims of unchecked unconscious drives, to that extent we may be vulnerable to mental manipulations. And although there is a horrifying fascination in the idea that our mental resistance is relatively weak, that the very quality which distinguishes one man from another, the individual I, can be profoundly altered by psychological pressures, such transformations are merely extremes of a process we find operating in normal life. Through systemized suggestions, subtle propaganda, and more overt mass hypnosis, the human mind in its expression is changed daily in any society. Advertisement seduces the democratic citizen into using quackers for one special brand of soap instead of another. Advertising seduces the democratic citizens into using quackeries or one special brand of soap instead of another. Our wish to buy things is continually stimulated. Campaigning politicians seeks to influence us by their grammar as well as their programs. Fashion experts hypnotize us into periodical changes of our standards of beauty and good taste. In cases of menticide, however, this assault of integrity of the human mind is more direct and premeditated. By planning on the irrational child lying hidden in the unconscious and the sharpening of the internal conflict between reason and emotion, the inquisitor can bring his victims to abject surrender. All of the victims of deliberate menticide, the prisoners of war in Korea, the imprisoned traitors to the dictatorial regimes of the Iron Curtain countries, the victims of the Nazi terror during the Second World War, are people whose ways of life had suddenly and dramatically altered. They had been torn from their homes, their families, their friends, and thrown into a threatening abnormal atmosphere. The very strangeness of their surrounding made them more vulnerable to any attack on their values and attitudes. When the dictator exploits his victim's psychological needs in a threatening, hostile, and familiar world, breakdown is almost sure to follow. The barbed wire disease. Already during the First World War, peculiar mental reactions, mixtures of apathy and rage, could be discerned in prisoners of war as defensive adjustment against the hardships of prison life. The boredom, the hunger, the lack of privacy, the continual insecurity. The Korea War added to this situation of the greater cruelty of the enemy and prolonged fear of death, malnutrition, diseases, systematic attacks of the prisoner's mind, the lack of sanitation, and the lack of all human dignity. Often improvement could be secured through acceptance of the totalitarian ideology. The psychological pressures not only led to involvement with the enemy, but caused mutual suspicion among the prisoners. As I have already described, the barbed wire disease begins with the initial apathy and despair of all prisoners. There is a passive surrender to fate. In fact, people can die out of such despair. It is as if all resistance were gone. Being anything but aloof and apathetic was even dangerous in a camp where the enemy wanted to debate and argue with you in order to tear down your mental resistance. Consequently, a vicious cycle was built up by apathy. Of apathy, not thinking, letting things go. A surrender to a complete zombie-like existence of mechanical dependency on the circumstances. Every sign of anger and alertness could be brutally punished by the enemy, and that is why we did not find those sudden attacks of rage that were observed in the earlier prisoners of war camps during World War I and II. Result of psychological testing of the liberated soldier from the Korean prisoners of war camps could indicate that their defensive apathy and retreat into secluded infantile dependency was likely to be found in nearly all of them. Yet, after being brought back into normal surroundings, alertness and activity returned rather soon, even in 2 or 3 days. Those few who remained anxious, apathetic, and zombie-like belong to the long chapter of war and the battle neurosis. What are some of the factors which can turn a man into a traitor to his own convictions, an informer, a confessor to heinous crimes, or an apparent collaborator? The moment of sudden surrender. Several victims of the Nazis' Inquisitorate had told me that the moment of sudden surrender occurred suddenly and against their will. For days they had faced the fury of the interrogators, and suddenly they fell apart. All right, you can have anything you want. And then came hours of remorse, of resolutions, of a desperate wish to return to their previous position of firm resistance. They wanted to cry out, "Don't ask me anything else, I won't answer." And yet something in them, that conforming, complying being hidden deep in all of us, was on the move. This sudden surrender often happened after unexpected accusations, a shock, a humiliation that particularly hurt, a punishment that burned, a surprising logic in the Inquisitor's questions that could not be counter-argued. I remembered an experience of my own that illustrates the effect of such surprise. After my escape from the Nazi prison in occupied Holland, I was able to reach the neutral Switzerland via Vichy, France. When I arrived, I was put in jail where, at first, I was treated rather kindly. After 3 days, however, I was denied an officer's right to asylum, and I was told that I would be deported back to Vichy, France. To this information, my jailers nearly added the comment that I should be happy that I was not going to be deported back to Germany. When I left to be transported to the border, I was asked to sign a paper stating that all my possessions, which had been taken from me on my imprisonment, had been returned. I refused to sign because a few things, unimportant in themselves, but of great emotional value to me, were not included in the package my jailers handed me. One of the guards looked at me with contempt. The second tapped his foot impatiently and repeatedly demanded that I sign the paper. The third scolded and shouted in French that was completely unintelligible to me. I continued firm in my refusal. Suddenly, one of the officers started to slap me around the face and to beat me. Overwhelmed by surprise that they would display such fury over bat jail, I surrendered and signed the paper. From the Vichy prison to which I was sent, I was permitted to write a letter to protest to the Swiss government. I still carry the official apology I received. This sudden change from the mood of defiant resistance to one of the submission must be explained by the unconscious actions of constrained feelings. Consciously, we tell ourselves to be strong, but from deep within us, we desire to give in and to comply begins to disturb us. Consciously, we tell ourselves to be strong, but from deep within us, we desire to give in and to comply begins to disturb us and to affect our behavior. In psychology, this is described as the innate ambivalence of all feelings. The need to collapse. The vocabulary of psychopathology contains many sophisticated terms of the wish to succumb to mental pressure, such as wish to regress, dependency need, mental masochism, unconscious death wish, and many others. For our purposes, however, it is enough to state that every individual has two opposing needs which operate simultaneously: the need to be independent, to be oneself, and the need to be oneself not only to anybody at all, not to exist, meant for our purpose, however, it is enough to state that every individual has two opposing needs which operate simultaneously: the need to be independent, to be oneself, and the need not to be oneself, not to be anybody at all, not to resist mental pressure, the need to be inconspicuous, to disappear, and to be swallowed up by society in a common one. In this simplest form, we can see it all around us as a tendency to conform. Under ordinary circumstances, the need for anonymity is balanced by the need for individuality, and the mentally healthy person is one who can walk the fine line between them. But in the frightening, lonely situations in which the victims of mental terror find themselves, situations which have a nightmare quality, which are crammed with dangers, but in the frightening, lonely situations in which the victims of mental terror find themselves, situations which have a nightmare quality, which are crammed with dangers so tremendous they cannot be grasped or understood because there is nobody to explain or reassure, the wish to collapse, to let go, to not go there becomes almost irresistible. This experience was reported by many concentration camps victims. They had come into camps with one unanswered questions burning in their minds. Why has all this happened to me? Their need for sense of direction, for a feeling of purpose and meaning was unsatisfied, and hence they could not maintain their personalities. They let themselves go in what psychopathology calls a depersonalization syndromes, a general feeling of having lost complete control of themselves and their own existence. What Pavlovian conditioning can do in applying artificial confusion can be done to one shocking experience. For what? The questions they ask themselves. What is the meaning of all this suffering? And gradually, they sank duly into paralyzed state of semi-oblivion we call depression. The self-destructive needs to take over. The Nazis were clever and unscrupulous in taking advantage of this need to collapse. The humiliation of concentration camp life The humiliation of the concentration camp life, the repeated suggestions that the allies were as good as beaten, this conspired to convince the enemies that they will not be This conspired to convince the enemies that there will be no end to this pointless suffering, no victorious conclusion to the war, no future to their lives. The desire to break down, to give in, becomes almost insurmountable, where a man feels that his horrible marginal existence is something permanent, that he cannot look toward a more personal goal, that he has to adjust to his darling, degrading life forever. At the moment faith and hope disappear, man breaks down. There are tragic stories of concentration camps victims who fixed all their expectation on the idea that liberation could come on Christmas, 1944, and aimed their entire existence toward the date. When it passed and they were still incarcerated, many of them simply collapsed and died. This tendency to collapse also serves as a protective device against danger. The victim seems to find, if my torturer doesn't notice me, he will leave me alone. And yet this very feeling of anonymity, this sense of losing one's personality, of being useless, unnoticed and unwanted, also results in depression and apathy. Man needs to be an individual, can never be completely killed. The need for companionship. Not enough attention has been given to the psychology of loneliness, especially to the implication of enforced isolation in prisoners. When the sensory stimuli of everyday life are removed, man's entire personality may change. Social intercourse, our continual contact with our colleagues, our work, the newspaper, voices, traffic, our loved ones, and even those who don't like, all are daily nourishment to our sense and minds. We select what we find interesting, reject what we do not want to absorb. Every day, every citizen lives in many small worlds of exchange of gratifications, literal hatreds, present experiences, irritations, delights. And he needs these stimuli to keep him on alert, hour by hour. Reality, in cooperation with our memory, integrates the millions of facts in our lives by repeating them over and over. As soon as man is alone, closed off from the world and from the news of what is going on, his mental activity is replaced by quite different processes. Long forgotten anxieties come to the surface. Long repressed memories knock on his mind from inside. His fantasies lives begin to develop and assume gigantic proportions. He cannot evaluate or check his fantasies against the events of his ordinary days, and very soon they may take possession of him. I remember very clearly my own fantasies during the time I was in the Nazi prison. It was almost impossible for me to control my depressive thoughts of hopelessness. I had to tell myself over and over again, think, keep your sense alert, don't give in. I tried to use all my psychiatric knowledge to keep my mind in a state of relaxed mobilization, and on many days I felt it was losing battle. Some experiments have shown that people who are deprived for even a very short time of all sensory stimuli, no touch, no hearing, no smell, no sight, quickly fall into a kind of hallucinatory hypnotic state. Isolation from the multitude of impressions that normally bombard us from the outside world creates a strange, frightening symptom. According to Heron, who performed experiments on a group of students at McGill University by placing each student in his own pitch-black soundproof room, ventilated with filtered air and encasing his hands in heavy leather mittens and his feet in heavy boots, little by little, their brains got deep or slipped out of control. Even in 24 hours of such extreme sensual isolation, all the horror phantoms of childhood are awakened, and the various pathological symptoms appear. Our instincts of curiosity demands continue feeding. If it is not certified, the internal hows of hell are aroused. The prisoner kept in isolations, although his isolation is not means as extreme as the laboratory test, also undergoes a severe mental change. His guards and inquisitors become more and more his only source of contact with reality. With those stimuli, he needs even more than bread. No wonder what he could gradually develop a peculiar submissive relations to them. He is affected not only by his isolation from social contact, but by sexual starvation as well. The latent dependency needs and latent homosexual tendencies that lie deep in all men make him willing to accept his guard as a substitute father figure. The inquisitor may be cruel and bestial, but the very fact that he acknowledges his victim's existence gives the prisoner a feeling that he has received some little bit of affection. What a conflict may thus arise between a man's traditional loyalties and these new ones. There are only a few personalities which are so completely self-sufficient that they can resist the need to yield to find some human companionship to overcome their unbearable loneliness. During the Second World Wars, prisoners at first suffered from peculiar burning homesickness, already called barbed wire disease. Memories of mother, home, and family made the soldiers identify with boyhood again. But as they became more used to the prison life, thoughts of home and family also created positive values and helped the prison camp life less harrowing. Even the prisoners who is not kept in isolation can feel lonely in the unrecognized mass of prisoners. His fellow prisoners can become his enemies as easily as they can become his friends. His hatred of his guards can be displaced and turned against those in prisons with him. Instead of suspecting the enemy, the victim may become suspicious of his companions in misery. In the Nazis' concentration camps and the Korean prisoners of war camps, a kind of mass paranoia often developed. Loneliness was increased because of the prisoners cut themselves off from one another through suspicion and hatred. This distrust was encouraged by the guards. They constantly suggested to their victim that nobody cared for them and nobody was concerned about what was happening to them. You are alone. Your friends on the outside don't know whether you are alive or dead. Your fellow prisoners don't even care. Thus, all expectation of the future was killed, and the resulting uncertainty and hopelessness became unbearable. Then the guards sowed suspicion and spread terrifying rumors. You are here because those people you call your friends betrayed you. Your buddies here have squalled on you. Your friends on the outside have deserted you. Preying on our old royalties, making him feel deserted and alone, force him into submission and collapse. The times that I myself wavered and entertained thoughts about joining the opposite forces always occurred after periods of extreme loneliness and deep-seated yearnings for companionship. I described this phenomena of self-betrayal in chapter 14. At such moments, the jailer of the enemy may become a substitute friend, blackmailing through overburdening guilt feelings. Deep within all of us lie hidden feelings of guilt, unconscious guilt, which can be brought to the surface under extreme stress. The strategy of arousing guilt is the mother's oldest tool of gaining dominance over her child's souls. Her warning and accusations finger or her threatening eyes give her a magic power over them and help to create deep-seated guilt feelings which may continue all through their adult lives. When we were children, we depended on our parents and resent them for just this reason. We may harbor hidden destructive wishes against those closest to us and feelings of guilt about these wishes. There is no question that most men have a profound loyalty to their families, but the primitive in him hates those he loves, and his hatred makes him feel guilty. Buried deep in his unconsciousness is the knowledge that his hostile fantasies he has felt himself capable of committing many crimes. Theodor Reich has drawn our attention to the unknown primitive murderer in us all, whose compulsion to confess and to be punished may be easily provoked under circumstances of terror and depression. This concept of concealed infertile hostility and destructiveness is often difficult for the layman to accept. But consider for a moment the popularity of the detective story. We may tell ourselves that we enjoy reading this tale because we identify with the keen and the clever sleuth, but as clear from the psychopathic experiences, the repressed criminal in all of us also at work, we also identify with the conscienceless killer. We also identify with the conscienceless killer. As a matter of fact, our repressed hostilities make the reading of hostile acts attractive to us. The methods of systematic exploiting unconscious guilt to create submission is not too well known, but it may better and the methods of systematic exploiting unconscious guilt to create submission is not too well known, but it may be better understood in the light of our investigation of the unconscious confession compulsion and the need for punishment. Guilt may be installed early in life when the parent urges the child too much and too early to apologize to his disobedience, or to use other means to burden the child with a sense of guilt when he does not understand what was unmoral or wrong about a given act. Teaching the child to use the right or the wrong does not necessarily imply being conditioned with submissiveness and anxious anticipation of punishment to follow. In one of my cases, the patient's mother cried after every little mistake the child made. "Look what you have done to me." It took protracted therapy to retrieve the patience of his hidden murderous impulse against his mother and his constant burden of guilt. In the political sphere, many such early child-rearing males are symbolically repeated. Continual purges and confession, as we encounter them in the totalitarian countries, arouse deeply hidden guilt feelings. The lesser sin of rebellion or subversion has to be admitted to cover personal thoughts of crime which are more deeply embedded. The personal reactions of those who are continually investigated give us a clue as to what happens. The very fact of prolonged interrogation can de-arouse the hidden and the unconscious guilt in the victim. At a time of extreme emotion, after constant accusation and the day-long interrogation, when he has been deprived of sleep and reduced to a state of utter despair, the victim may lose the capacity to distinguish between the real criminal act of which he is accused and his own fantasized unconscious guilt. If his upbringing burdened him with an almost pathological sense of guilt under normal circumstances, he will now be compelled, unable to resist, the menticidal attack. Even normal people may be brought to surrender under such miserable conditions, not only through the action of inquisitions, but also because of all other weakening factors. Lack of sleep, hunger, and illness can create utter confusion and make any man vulnerable to hypnotic influences. All of us have experienced the mental fuzziness which comes with being overtired. Concentration camps victims know how hunger, especially, induces a loss of mental control. In the fantastic world of totalitarian prisons or camps, these effects are heightened and exaggerated. The Nazis, through clever exploitation of their victims' unconscious guilt, after poking into back corners of their minds, were often able to convert courageous resistance fighters into meek collaborators. That they were not uniformly successful can be explained by two factors. The fact is that most of the members of the underground were inwardly prepared for the brutality with which they were treated. The second is that, clever as the Nazis' techniques were, they were not as irresistible as the methodical tricks of the communist brainwashers are. When victims of the Nazi brutality did break down, it was not torture, but often the threat of reprisal against family which made them give in. Sudden acute confrontation with a long-buried childhood problem create confusion and doubt. All of a sudden, the enemy puts before you a crush of loyalties. your father or your friends, your brother or your fatherland, your wife or your honor. This is a brutal choice to have to make, and when the Inquisitor makes use of your additional inner conflict, he can easily force you into surrender. A clash between loyalties makes either choice a betrayal, and this arouses paralyzing doubt. This calculated but subtle attack on the wicked spots in man's mind, on a man's conscience, and on the moral system he has learned from the Judeo-Christian ethics paralyzes the reason and leads the victim more easily into betrayal. The Inquisitor subtly tests his victim's actual guilt feelings towards paternal figures, his friends, and his children. He cleverly exploits the victim's early ambivalent ties with his parents. The sudden outbreak of hidden moral flaws and guilt can bring a man tears into complete breakdown. He regresses to the dependency and submissiveness of the baby. A very husky former hero of the Duchess resistance, known as King Kong, because of his size and strength, became the treacherous instruments of the Nazis. Soon after his brother had been taken with him, and the Nazis threatened to kill the youth. King Kong's final surrender to the enemy and his becoming their treacherous tool was psychiatrically recognized as a defense mechanism against his deeper guilt, arising from hidden feelings of aggression against his brother. Another example of breakdown is seen in the theory of young resistance fighter who, after the Nazis had threatened to torture his father, who was imprisoned with him, finally broke into childish tears and promised to tell them everything they wanted to know. After that, he was taken back to his cell in order to be softened up against the following day. This was the routine of his interrogator. The Inquisitors understood only too well the effectiveness of the patient pursuit as repeated moments while intruding a man's guilt feelings. Although both prisoners were liberated that night as consequences of the Allied sweep through Belgium and the southwest part of Holland, the boy remained in his depression for a long time, tortured by his knowledge that he had nearly betrayed his best friends in the background in order to save his father, in spite of knowing, at the same time, that the promises of the enemy would not have protected his father. In the subsequent psychological exploitation of the boy's breakdown and depressions, his dreams give us a clue to his long-buried aggressive fantasies against his father, whom he had symbolically killed in his dreams. The sense of guilt about his unconscious infantile hostility had weighed more heavily on his conscience than the possibility of being guilty towards his fellow partisans. A conscious understanding of what his difficulties had been, plus renewed military activity, did much to help him cope with the conflicts of what tortured him. But other unwillingly traitors were less fortunate. When finally they realized the enormity of their betrayal, several of them became psychotically depressed, and some even committed suicide. The law of survival versus the law of loyalty. The prisoners of war in Korea, who gradually gave in to the systematic mental pressure of the enemy and collaborated in production of materials that could be used in communist propaganda, albeit tentatively for only as long as they were in the orbit of the enemy, followed a peculiar psychological law of the passive inner defense and inner deceit that when one cannot fight and defeat the enemy, one must join his team. Later, a few of them were so taken in by the totalitarian propaganda that they elected to remain in China and the totalitarian orbiter. Some did to escape punishment from having betrayed their comrades. Man cannot become a turncoat without justifying his action to himself. When Holland surrendered to German army in 1940, I saw his general mechanism of mental surrender operating in several people who had been staunch anti-Nazis. Maybe there is something good in Nazism, they told themselves as they saw the tremendous show of German strength. Those who were the victims of their own initial mental surrender and need to justify things, who could not stop and say to themselves, "Hold on there, think this out," became the traitors and collaborators. They were completely taken in by the enemy's show of strength. The same process of self-justification and justifying the enemy started in the prisoners of war camps. Experiences from the concentration camps give us some indication of how far this passive submission of the enemy can go. Because of the deep-seated human need for affection, many prisoners lived only for one thing: a friendly word form. Their guards, a friendly word from their guards. Each time it came, it fortified the delusion of grace and acceptance. Once these prisoners, mostly those who had been in camps for a long time, were accepted by the guards, they easily became the trusted tools of the Nazis. They started to behave like their cruel jailers and became torturers of their fellow campers. These collaborating prisoners, called capos, were even more cruel and vengeful than the officials, the overseers. Because of the misunderstood inner needs, the brainwasher and the sadist camp leader is direly in need of collaborators. They serve not only for propaganda machine but also to exonerate their jailers from guilt. When a man has to choose either hunger, death matches, and torture, or a temporary leading to illusion of the enemy, his self-preservation mechanism act in many ways like reflexes. They help him to find thousands of justifications and expulsion for giving in to the psychological pressure. One of the officers caught Mathilde for collaborating with the enemy in a Korean prisoners of war camp justified his conduct by saying that he followed his course of action in order to keep himself and his men alive. Is that not a perfectly valid, though not necessarily true, argument? The use of it serves to point out the fact that self-protective mechanisms are usually much stronger than ideological loyalty. No one who has not faced this sense of bitter problem can have a psychiatric. No one who has not faced this same bitter problem can have an objective opinion as to what he himself will do under the circumstance. As a psychiatrist, I suggest that most people will lead to compromises when threat and mental pressure become strong enough. Among the anti-Nazi undergrounds in the Second World War were the physically strong boys who thought they could resist all pressure and will never betray their comrades. However, they could not even begin to imagine the perfidious technique of menticide. Repeated pestering itself is more destructive than the physical torture. The pain of physical torture, as we have said, brings temporary unconsciousness and consequently forgetfulness, but when the victim wakes up, the play of anticipation begins. Will it happen again? Can I stand it anymore? Anticipation paralyzes the will. Suicidal thoughts and identifications with death do not help. The foe doesn't let you die, but drags you back from the edge of oblivion. The anticipation of renewed fortune increases internal anxieties. Who am I to stand all this? Why must I be a hero? Gradually resistance breaks down.
Among the anti-Nazi undergrounds in the Second World War were physically strong boys who thought that they could resist all pressure, they will never betray their comrades. However, they could not even begin to imagine the perfidious techniques of menticide. Repeated pestering itself is more destructive than physical torture. The pain of physical torture, as we have said, brings contemporary unconsciousness and consequently forgetfulness. But when the victim wakes up, the play of anticipation begins. Will it happen again? Can I stand it in anymore? Anticipation paralyzes the will. Suicidal thoughts and identifications with death do not help. The foe doesn't let you die, but drags you back from the edge of oblivion. The anticipation of renewed torture increases internal anxieties. Who am I to stand all this? Why must I be a hero? Gradual resistance breaks down. The surrender of the mind to its new master does not take place immediately under the impact of duress or exhaustion. The inquisitor knows that in the period of temporary relaxation of pressure, during which the victim will rehearse the repeat torture experience to himself, the final surrender is prepared. During that tension of rumination and anticipation, the deeply hidden wish to give in grows. The anticipation of continual repetition of stupid questions reiterated for days and days exhausts the mind till it gives the answer the inquisitor wants to have. In addition to the weapon of mental exhaustion, he plays on the physical exhaustion of the senses. He may use penetrating, excruciating noises or a constant strong flashlight that blinds the eyes. The need to close the eyes or to get away from the noise confuses the mental orientation of the victim. He loses his balance and feelings of self-confidence. He yearns to sleep and to do nothing else but surrender. The infantile desire to become part of the threatening giant machine, to become one with forces that are so much stronger than the prisoner has won. It is an unequivocal surrender. Do with me what you want. From now on, I am you. That only deprivation from sleep is able to produce various abnormal reactions of the mind was confirmed by Taylor in an experiment with 350 male volunteers. He deprived them of sleep for 102 hours. 44 men dropped out almost once because they felt too anxious and irritated. After 40 hours without sleep, 70% of all subjects had already After 40 hours without sleep, 70% of all subjects had already had delusions, hallucinations, and similar experiences. Those who had the true hallucinations were dropped from the experiment. After the second night, sporadic disturbances of thinking were common to all subjects. The participants were embarrassed when they were informed later of their behavior. The changes in emotional response had been most noticeably euphoria, followed by depression, dejection, and relentlessness, indifference to unusual behavior shown by other suspects. The experiment gave the impression that the prolonged wakefulness causes some toxic substance to affect the brain and the mind. Only the few strong, independent, and self-sufficient personalities who had conquered their dependency needs can stand such pressure or are willing to die under it. The ritual of self-accusation and breast-beating and unconditional surrender to the rules of the elders is part of the age-old religious ties. It was based on more or less unconscious belief in a supreme and omnipotent power. This power may be the monolithic party-state of the mystery. This power may be the monolithic party-state or a mysterious deity. It follows the old inner device of credo quinia absurdum. I believe because it's absurd, or faithful submission to a superworld, stronger than the reality which confronts our senses. When the totalitarian and the orthodox dogmatic ideology sticks to such a rigid attitude, with prohibition of investigations of basic premises, is a complicated psychological question. Somewhere the reason is related to the fear of change, the fear of the risk of change of habits, the fear of freedom, which may be psychologically related to the fear of the finality of death. The denial of human freedom and equality leaves the authoritarian man beyond his moral fellows. His temporary power and omnipotence give him the illusion of eternity. In his totalitarianism, he denies death and inferior existence and borrows power from the future. He has to invent and formulate the final truth and protective dogma to justify his battle against morality. And temporariness. From then on, the new fundamental certainty must be hammered into the mind of the adepts and slaves. What happens inside the human psyche under severe circumstances of mental and physical attack is clarified to us by Anna Freud in her book on the general mental defenses available to man. Earlier, I myself tried in several publications to analyze the various ways people defend themselves against fear and pressure. In the past phase of brainwashing and menticide, the self-humiliating submission of the victim serves as the inner defense device, annihilating the prospecting inquisitor in a magic way. The more they accuse themselves, the less the logical reason there is for this existence. The more they accuse themselves, the less the logical there is for his existence. Giving in and being even more cruel toward oneself make the inquisitor and the judge, as it were, impotent and shows the futility of accusing regime. We may say that brainwashing and menticide provoke the same inner defensive mechanism that we observe in melancholic patients. Through their mental self-beatings, they try to get rid of fear and avoid a more deep-seated guilt. They punish themselves in advance in order to overcome the idea of final punishment for some hidden, unknown, and worse crime. The victim of menticide conquers his tormentor by becoming even more cruel toward himself than the inquisitor. In this passive way, he annihilates his enemy. The mysterious masochistic pact. In Arthur's masterpiece, Darkness at Noon, he describes all the subtle intricacies, reasoning and dialectics between the inquisitor and his victim. The old Bolshevik, Rubashov, preconditioned by his former party adherents, confesses to plotting against the party and the party line. He is partly motivated by the wish to render the last service. His confession is a final sacrifice to the party. I would explain the confession rather as part of the mysterious masochistic pact between the inquisitor and his victim with an encounter. 2. In other procession, I would explain the confession rather as part of the mysterious masochistic pact between the inquisitor and his victim which we encounter. 2. In other processes of brainwashing. The term masochism originally referred to sexual gratification received from pain and punishment, and later became every gratification acquired through pain and objection. It is the last gift and the trick the tortured gives to his tormentor. It is as if we are to call out, "Be good to me, I confess, I submit, be good to me and love me." After having suffered all the manner of brutality, hypnotism, despair and panic, there is a final quest for human companionship, but it is ambivalent, mixed with deep despair, hatred and bitterness. Tortured and torturer gradually form a peculiar community in which the one influences the other, just as in therapeutic session where the patient identifies with the psychiatrist. The daily sessions of interrogation and conversation create an unconscious transfer of feelings in which the prisoner identifies with his inquisitor and his inquisitor with him. The prisoner, encaptured in a strange, harsh and unfamiliar world, identifies much more with the enemy than does the enemy with him. Outwittingly, he may take over all the enemy norms, evaluations, and attitudes towards life. Such passive surrender to the enemy's ideology is determined by unconscious processes. The danger of communion of this kind is that at the end all moral evaluations disappear. We saw it happen in Germany. The very victims of Nazism came to accept the idea of concentration camps. In menticide, we are faced with a ritual like that found in witch hunting during the Middle East ages. Except that today the ritual has taken a more refined form, accuser and accused. Each affords the other resistance, and both belong together as collaborating members of a ritual of confession and self-degeneration. Through their cooperation, they attack the minds of bystanders who identify with them and consequently feel guilty, weak, and submissive. The Moscow Purge trials made many Russians feel guilty listening to the confessions. They must have said to themselves, "I could have done the same thing. I could have been in the man's place." When their heroes became traitors, their own hidden treasonable wishes made them feel weak and frightened. This explanation may seem overly complicated and involved and perhaps even self-contradictory, but in fact, it happens to us to understand This explanation may seem overly complicated and involved and perhaps even self-contradictory, but in fact, it happens to us to understand what happens in cases of menticide. Both torturer and tortured are the victims of their own unconscious guilt. The torturer projects his guilt onto some outside scapegoats and tries to expiate it by attacking his victim. The victim too has a sense of guilt which arises from deeply repressed childhood hostilities. Under normal circumstances, this sense is kept under control, but in the menticidal atmosphere of relentless interrogation and inquisitions, his repressed hostilities are aroused and loom up. Under normal circumstances, this sense is kept under control, but in the menticidal atmosphere of relentless interrogation and inquisitions, his repressed hostilities are aroused and loom up as frightening phantasmagorians from the forgotten past, which the victim senses but cannot grasp or understand. It is easier to confess to the accusations of treason and sabotage than to accept the frightening sense of criminality with which his long-forgotten aggressive impulses now burden him. The victim's overt self-accusations serves as a trick to annihilate the inner accuser and the prosecuting inquisitor. The more I accuse myself, the less reasons there is for the inquisitor existence. The victims going to the gallows kills, as it were, the inquisitor too, because there existed a mutual identifications. The accuser is made impotent the moment the victim begins to accuse himself, and tomorrow the accuser himself may be accused and brought to the gallows. Out of our understanding of this strange machistic pact between accuser and accused comes a rather simple answer to the questions. Why do people want to control the minds of others? And why do others confess and yield? It is because there is no essential difference between the victim and the inquisitor. They are alike. Neither, under these circumstances, has any control over his deeply hidden criminal and hostile thoughts and feelings. It is obviously easy to be the inquisitor than the victim, not only because the inquisitor may be temporarily safe from the mental physical distractions, but also because it is simpler to punish others for what we feel as criminal in ourselves than it is to face up our own hidden senses of guilt. Committing menticide is less a crime of aggression which covers up the inner deeper crime of unresolved hidden hatred and distractions. It is obviously easier to be the inquisitor than the victim, not only because the inquisitor may be temporarily safe from the mental and physical distractions, but also because it is simpler to punish others to what we feel as criminal in ourselves than it is to face for our own hidden sense of guilt. Committing menticide is the lesser crime of aggression, which covers up the deeper crime of unresolved hidden hatred and distraction. The survey of psychological processes involved in brainwashing and menticide. At the end of this chapter, describing the various influences that lead to yielding and surrender to the enemy's strategy, it is useful to give a short survey of the psychological processes involved. Phase 1. Artificial breakdown and deconditioning. The inquisitor tries to weaken the ego of his prisoner. Though original physical torture was used, hunger and cold were still very effective. Physical torture may often increase the person's stubbornness. Torture is intended to Torture is intended to be much greater extent to the act as a threat of Torture is intended to be much greater extent to act as a threat to the bystanders. Torture is intended to be much greater extent to act as a threat to the bystanders, the people's imagination. Their wild anticipation of torture leads more easily to their breakdown when the enemy has need of their weakness. Of course, occasionally, a sadist enemy may find individual pressure in torture. The many devices the enemy makes use of include intimidating suggestions, dramatic persuasions, mass suggestions, humiliation, embarrassment, loneliness and isolation, continued interrogation, overburdening the physical unsteady mind, arousing more and more self-pity. Patience and time help the inquisitor to soften the stubborn soul. Just as in many old religions, the victims were humbled and humiliated in order to prepare for new religion. So, in this case, they are prepared to accept the totalitarian ideology. In this phase, out of mere intellectual optimism, the victim may consciously give in. Just in many old religions, the victims were humbled and humiliated in order to prepare for the new religion. So in this case, they are prepared to accept the totalitarian ideology. In this phase, out of mere intellectual optimism, the victim may consciously give in. Phase 2. Submission to positive identification with the enemy. As has already been conditioned, the moment of surrender may often arrive suddenly. It is as if the stubborn negative suggestibility changed critically into a surrender and affirmation. What the Inquisitor calls the surrender in What the Inquisitor calls the sudden inner illumination and conversion is a total reversal of the inner strategy in the victim. From this time on, in psychoanalytic terms, a parasitic superego lives in the man's concerns, and he will speak his new master's voice. In my experience, such sudden surrender often occurred together with hysterical outbursts into crying and laughter, like a baby surrendering after obstinate temper tantrums. The Inquisitor can attain his phase more easily by assuming paternal attitude. As a matter of fact, many prisoners of war was encountered by a form of paternal kindness, gifts, sweets and birthdays, and the promise of more cheerful things to come. Moloney compares this sudden yielding with the theophany or kenosis, internal conversions. Moloney compares this sudden yielding with theophany or kenosis, internal conversion, as described by some theological rites. For our understanding, it is important to stress that yielding is an unconscious and purely emotional process, no longer under the conscious intellectual control of the brainwashee. We may also call this phase the phase of auto-hypnosis. Phase 3. The reconditioning of the new order. Through both continued training and taming, the new phonograph record has to be grooved. Through both continued training and taming, the new phonograph record has to be grooved. We may compare this process with an active hypnosis into conversion. Incidental relapse to the old form of thinking have to be corrected in phase 1. The victim is daily helped to rationalize and justify his new ideology. The Inquisitor delivers to him the new arguments and reasoning. This systematic indoctrination of those who no longer avoided intensive indoctrination constitutes the actual political aspect of brainwashing and symbolizes the ideological Cold War going on at this very moment. Phase 4. liberation from the totalitarian spell. As soon as the brainwashing returns to the free democratic atmosphere, the hypnotic spell is broken. Temporary nervous repercussion takes place, like crying spells, feeling of guilt and depression. The expectation of a hostile homeland in view of his having yielded to enemy indoctrination may fortify his reaction. The period of brainwashing becomes a nightmare. Only those who were staunch communists before may stick to it, but here too I have seen the enemy impose its mental pressure too well and convert their former comrades into eternal haters of the regime.